Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Acquisition Research Symposium. And thank you for joining us at Creating Synergy for Informed Change, Transitioning Technology to the Warfighter, which is clearly an important topic these days. So this is the NPS 22nd Annual Acquisition Research Symposium on Innovation and Innovation Summit, hosted by the Acquisition Research Program at the Naval Postgraduate School. And of course, welcome to our panel, which is Strengthening Defense Ties, Cooperation, Innovation, and Partnership. I will say this symposium has been going on now for about 22 years. And this year is the first time when we've incorporated more of the operational flavor to it. In the past couple of decades, we focused significantly on acquisition specific research, and we're now really moving into where we need to go with how do you innovate, how do you transition technology and capability to the warfighter. So my name is Raymond Jones, Ray Jones. I'm the department chair for the Department of Defense Management at the Naval Postgraduate School. We focus on all things acquisition, so big A acquisition. We have several degrees in program management, contract management, logistics, manpower, and financial management, and of course, general management across the board, across all of those. We do also do a lot of acquisition research, and most importantly, we do a lot of interdisciplinary. So we're really focusing on technology, not just from the standpoint of advancing the technological capability, but also how do you integrate technology into the fight? How do you build in the business processes, the dot mil PF processes while you're developing the technology? So it's a really big emphasis for us of getting not just the technology right, but also getting the ability to transition that technology to the warfighter at the right time. I'm also joined today with our esteemed panelists. I'm going to give you their names and their titles, and I will let them introduce themselves when they, a little bit more about themselves when they get ready to speak. So first up, we have Katy Buda. She's the Assistant Director for Defense Industrial Initiatives Group, the Center of Strategic and International Studies. And then we have Nathan Picarsic, who's the co-founder for Horizon Advisory and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and visiting fellow at Krach Institute for Tech Diplomacy. And then finally, we have Audrey Aldersert. She's Research Associate, Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So welcome all the panelists, and we look forward to your comments. I would like to say that by way of sort of orientation here, if you have a question, put it in the questions box, and what we'll do is we will wait to the end for all the questions to be, and we'll go through those. And of course, if there's an opportunity, I'll have a couple of questions as well after I've read these very interesting papers. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and start with Katy. Again, Katy's topic is enhancing defense industrial cooperation between Australia and the United States. Over to you, Katy.
Hi everyone. Thank you for having me today. My name is Katy Buda, and I'm an Associate Director, the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm really pleased to be here and present research from my team, and it was also a joint project with the Australia chair at CSIS. And this research was conducted to look at the bilateral defense industrial relationship between the two countries, but then also taking into account AUKUS and other initiatives and really focusing on how to decrease the barriers to companies who want to do business with a partner nation. So my research partners for this endeavor included Dr. Cynthia Cook, our team leader, and one of the research associates on our team, Henry Carroll. The paper submitted to NPS and the research presented today is a selection from a larger research work, which is under the same title, Enhancing Defense Industrial Cooperation between Australia and the United States. And that report can be found on the DIG webpage on the CSIS website. Next slide. So to give you some background on the project, it was funded by the Strategic Policy Grant Program through Australia's Defense Department. And the project considered the impact of AUKUS, but it really was narrowed down after talks with our sponsor, focusing on the bilateral relationship. And the methodology included quantitative data from the U.S. International Trade Commission, the U.S. Contracting data, and then also SIPRI data. And then the qualitative data included research from interviews with both companies in each country and also government officials in each country. And so we conducted almost 30 interviews, companies from both countries, and really got an idea of what were the challenges that they were facing, what challenges, if overcome, would really help them increase business opportunities. And this also included a conference in Canberra and then a sister conference in DC. So a large pool of data came from SMEs, or small medium enterprises, in Australia looking to do business with the US. But then we also talked to a lot of US defense primes and other companies. And so we kind of got a well-rounded approach of bigger and smaller companies in each country and what were the challenges they were facing. And these included regulatory hurdles, cultural differences, and other reasons. But first, want to provide some context on the trade relationship between the two countries. And so that's what the next slides will showcase. So here we have a chart showing trade between Australia and its close allies. As you can see here, Australia has historically conducted extensive trade with the US, but this was primarily in imports, and they have had a more recent growth in exports, but there's a greater growth in their exports with other countries shown. Next slide. And then in this next graphic, we can see trade between the United States and Australia, Canada, and the UK. So this is really important to show kind of how these close allies, how they pursue trade with each other. They're all part of the National Technology Industrial Base. And then also they're all part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Network. So it's important to keep in mind the other frameworks that these countries are involved in and how those frameworks maybe bring them closer together, maybe increase trade through a close ally relationship. And so we can see that trade between the US and Canada and the UK it's a little more even between exports and imports, whereas you see between the US and Australia, it's much more import heavy for Australia taking in imports from the US. And then on the next slide, we'll have another chart that shows the shares of US DoD prime contracts. And these go to, in this chart showing contracts going to the United Kingdom, to Canada, and to Australian companies. And you also see the breakdown of companies. So is this the parent company? Is this a US subsidiary in the US? How do these different companies take up the share of US DoD prime contracts? And so for the UK, a big portion of the data shown is from BAE's subsidiary in the US. And so this shows that for Canada, most of the contracts are the parent international company, while for the UK and Australia, subsidies in the US of companies from these two countries are more likely to be to gain US DoD prime contracts. And then moving on, we get into the barriers we encountered in the research and our classification system for those barriers. So the previous slides were meant to demonstrate the current historical trade and business relationship between Australia, the US, and close allies, similar allies. These next two slides will focus on the range of barrier types we encountered We'll learn about a wide group of issues and why we needed to be able to categorize them in this way. And so we used a framework from Jennifer Maroney and her colleagues at RAND. They provided a fabulous framework. There was a study on government-to-government cooperation between Australia and the US. Our study focused more on the industry angle. And so you'll see on the next slide, not yet, you'll see that we added another component, which is economic. But for this slide, you can see we have budgetary, bureaucratic, cultural, and political barrier classifications. And one of the things I thought was interesting to highlight, one of the barriers we encountered was a cultural barrier. And so we learned that Australian companies approach sales pitches differently than the US. They lean more towards sharing the positives and negatives of their product, whereas the US tends to maybe not gloss over, but maybe focus on the strengths of what they're trying to sell. And so there was some experiences of the companies we talked to, the Australian companies, of not having the reaction they expected because of being honest about, here's what the technology can do, here's what we're working to fix, here's where we'd like to take it, things of that nature. So it's good to keep in mind that, there's the very tangible, like regulatory barriers and, the tyranny of distance and things like that. And then there are also more kind of like cultural and how you approach business dealings as barriers that we encounter in the research. And then on the next slide, we can see we have regulatory, strategic, technical, and economic barriers. The economic one is the one I highlighted as new. And so we really wanted to be able to incorporate more of the industry perspective and of those barriers that didn't quite fit into the other classifications. And an interesting barrier we heard about from companies, which is kind of both regulatory and bureaucratic, was the use of no foreign classifications. So when an Australian company we talked to was trying to visit a US defense prime to discuss their product and work on a deal, they weren't even allowed to go into the cafeteria at the US defense prime's offices, the US. So it was labeled no foreign. So like there's just those kind of like nitty gritty issues of classifications and overclassifications where, everything is very risk averse, and that can be both a benefit, and we need those types of systems and export control systems to protect our information. But there's also issues when it comes to doing business with partner nations that you don't even think about, which is just having places to pitch and do business and show demonstrations where, allies are allowed to be on a base or in a company's headquarters and be able to discuss, or even just over emails or things of that nature in terms of information sharing. So there was an impression that acquisition export control professionals would default to overclassifying information or preferring US-made products, even if the top level messaging was calling for closer defense industrial cooperation. And so even lawyers of US defense primes would also rely on, a very safe choice, even if there wasn't necessarily a US government regulatory barrier. They would, everyone seemed to have the impression that the default for the US government and for US defense primes was to be risk averse. And then on the next slide, we have here a chart that was developed by our team to show the pathways in which Australia and the US were conducting business. So this shows all the different ways, either through government to government sales like FMS, or through companies, through subsidiaries. The companies we talked to were all pursuing a range of different pathways in order to do business. And some of those were not always efficient. There was one company, an Australian company, that wanted to sell to the Australian government, but they had to sell to a US prime, and then that prime had to sell to the US government, and the US government had to FMS over the product to the Australian government. So it just shows that there's a range of pathways in which business can be conducted. They're not always the most efficient, but sometimes they're the only ones possible to get around certain barriers. And then moving on to the next slide, we get to talk about recommendations. So we had the graphs that show the current trade relationship, with a chart showing the types of barriers encountered. We had the pathways of how business takes place between the two nations, and also talked about different examples of the type of barriers we encountered through learned about through talking to companies and government officials. And now we get to talk about the recommendations. So this is the budgetary and technical barriers. A big takeaway here is that shared requirements and working groups can lead to shared standards and interoperability. And that takes a huge burden off, a huge hurdle away when it comes to demonstrations, development, and trade between the two countries, which is further emphasized on the next slide, where we talk more about shared standards. And this continues the idea of the need for shared standards and the ways in which the AUKUS framework can facilitate these changes. So a key change to keep in mind for the regulatory barriers and then the recommendations is that there is a new license-free environment in play between Australia, the US, and the UK, and these changes are actually occurring as we were wrapping up the bulk of our research. So some of the barriers that the companies talked about might now be lessened or have gone away, but it's still important to consider the perceptions. So even when barriers are addressed, there's still an important component when it comes to messaging and companies knowing that those barriers are no longer there and knowing that it might be easier to pursue a certain deal or certain acquisition opportunity because of those changes. So it's not just about the changes, it's about the messaging, and then it's about the comfort level of companies operating with those changes. And, there's still a perception that the US system is a large, difficult bureaucracy with strict export controls. And even when changes are made, companies might still have, foreign companies might still have this kind of hesitancy, or if they see an easier option, they might want to pursue that, even if they have a capability that the US doesn't have and readily needs and hasn't developed yet. And then moving on to the next slide, we can look at our barriers that have to deal with cultural, political, and strategic barriers. I want to highlight here the messaging component that I've talked before about, and it's really important, especially within the new AUKUS framework and with the initiative to pursue development and trade of Pillar 2 dual use and emerging technologies, that the messaging from governments to industry is really important. Here we're talking about the ways in which different components of government talk to each other. And then on the final slide, for the economic barriers, we're also looking at how governments talk to industry and how different investment and education opportunities can be pursued to get the acquisition professionals comfortable with not always choosing the domestic company, and with perhaps pursuing a little bit of risk, and then also education for companies of how to work with each country's acquisition systems. And this just highlights different opportunities and different ways in which education and investment can be used to overcome some of the barriers, and at least provide more opportunities for learning how to work with the barriers that are there, not changing, and then also to perhaps work in the new license-free environment and to pursue closer defense industrial cooperation between the two nations. So thank you for your time today, and happy to answer any questions later.
Katy, thanks for that great presentation. Super important topic. I will tell you, I plan on asking you some questions as we get closer, because it's so important, and get your thoughts on some of, particularly on the education side. I'd like to now move on to Nathan Picarsic. His paper is entitled "Competing at the Upstream of Innovation, the U.S.-China Balance in Critical Minerals." What do you, Nathan, and your colleague? Please introduce your colleague to us.
Thank you, Professor Jones. I'm joined by my co-author, Emily Delabriere. And as noted, we're presenting a paper titled Competing at the Upstream of Innovation. Typically, when we think about military innovation, we're often framing the questions around the delivery of effects, the emergence of new capabilities, and downstream system level advances. What we set out to explore in this paper was looking at the upstream of those advances and the very real material inputs that are required to propel modern and emerging military capabilities. Our hypothesis was that the United States and China, America's pacing near peer adversary in great power competition, possibly adopt different approaches at the upstream in raw materials, and our paper explored what those differences might be and how they generate implications for broader strategic competition. We can jump to the next slide, please. So here we start with a quote from Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, leader of the Chinese military, where he's fairly explicitly noting, as far back as 2016, that China has a desire to control critical components and inputs, and they do so for fear of, as he puts it, building a house on someone else's foundation. They, from this point forward, and elevation of military-civil fusion as a national strategy around the same time, pursue upstream security of supply, and they do so in a way that is now manifesting in U.S.-China strategic competition. When America imposes export restrictions on downstream technologies like semiconductor equipment, China responds in kind, but targets their natural enduring advantages at the upstream. So we see over the past year, restrictions on export from China of materials like gallium, germanium, antimony. And when we see dominance of Chinese supply of critical military inputs like nitrocellulose, we can extrapolate that the threat that China poses is perhaps even more severe than we've realized so far. And this framing of a competitive upstream competition is what we used at the outset to pursue questions around relative US and Chinese standing. Next slide, please. The bottom line up front of the research that we presented in the paper, and we'll talk through in some amount of detail here today, is that the competition that we've seen so far between the United States and China that has certainly been escalating and across a range of domains has largely played out in peacetime salvos, economic warfare, economic statecraft, use of financial tools, use of sanctions and export restrictions. Critical minerals have emerged clearly on both sides in the United States and China as a useful battleground and set of means for executing strategy against the adversary. China has a long-standing orientation toward emphasizing security around critical minerals. They have an explicit definition of the national security value of critical minerals that are seemingly commercial and non-military that dates back into codification of the 1986 Mineral Resources Law in China. Certainly, we've seen over the past few years an uptick in American recognition of threats of dependence on China, and continued work to identify and secure supply chains at the far upstream all the way through midstream processing and downstream delivery of critical oxides and alloys. Clearly, it appears that America is behind in the current moment, and the problem posed by China is perhaps even worse than just the static benchmarking of being behind. China's approach leverages its critical minerals positioning, not just for defensive means, but also for offensive means. And China, in the realm of upstream materials, looks to disproportionately invest in research and development to guarantee access to next generation breakthroughs from material science and related areas of science and technology, in a way that's actually quite different from their behavior in other science and technological domains. That means that China may well be positioned to continue to build on this strength moving forward at a time when it clearly is increasing in its strategic value in the US-China competition. With all of that said, the scope and direction of the defense acquisition ecosystem, the role of the ecosystem in spurring and fielding military innovation promises to be a useful piece of the arsenal for the United States as it looks to compete with China's positioning and strategy. As we move into the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the key findings from our research.
And we start in these key findings with how the two sides, the US and China, define what critical minerals are. As Nate mentioned, Beijing has long prioritized critical minerals and the upstream of value chains generally. The US is catching up in terms of recognizing the importance of those to contemporary geopolitical competition. For a Chinese definition of what critical minerals are, in 2016, China's Ministry of Land and Resources published the National Mineral Resources Plan. That plan included a list of 24 strategic minerals covering energy, metallic, and non-metallic minerals. And those are listed on the left in this table here. One little clarification is that that list presents rare earths just as one group. There are 17 of those, so that's going to lead to a little bit of comparison difficulty with our other side, which is the US. So a year after China issued its National Mineral Resources Plan, pursuant to a US executive order, Washington began to publish lists of critical minerals. And the most recent such list was published in 2022, and it covers 50 minerals. Everything in bold on this table is a mineral that's listed on both the US and the Chinese sets of critical minerals. In other words, there's a good deal of overlap here. One core difference is that China includes energy minerals, so oil, natural gas, shale gas, coal bed methane, and uranium among its critical minerals, while the US does not. And then there are other smaller picture differences. For example, China includes iron, copper, gold, the US doesn't. The US includes zinc, which China does not. That's definitional difference at the small level. One big picture difference, and we'll get to this in the asymmetries too, but that's very important, is how the two sides think about what strategic minerals are. China's National Mineral Plan defines strategic minerals based on their value to industry and to national security, and both defensively and offensively. These are minerals necessary according to the plan to, quote, safeguard national economic security, national defense security, and the development needs of strategic emerging industries. The US, by contrast, in the 2017 Executive Order 13817A, clarifies that strategic minerals are only strategic if basically there's a supply disruption threat. So they have to be essential to economic and national security, but they also have to have supply chains that are vulnerable to disruption. So a big picture difference that helps provide a little bit of context for the specific minerals that are called out. If we move on to the next slide, that connected to that supply chain disruption element of the US framing, but also connected to the much longer term Chinese emphasis on the upstream value chains, is the reality that competitively speaking across every one of these critical minerals, those that are included on both the US and Chinese lists or on the US or just in the Chinese ones, China is ahead. The US is more than 50% import dependent in most of the minerals that it has identified as critical. In 30 of the 50, the US relies on China as one of its major suppliers. And that remains true even at this point, years after the US list of critical minerals has been published and the US has increased its investment in those. China is essentially only in one mineral completely reliant on foreign imports. So Beijing is really stronger across the board in its positioning. If we move on to the next slide, the two countries zooming out, have very asymmetric orientations towards the critical mineral approach, which means that even as the US is increasingly aware of being behind and increasingly aware of the importance of critical minerals, it's not just a race to catch up to China on the terms that the US has taken in the critical mineral competition. We're looking at a very different approach to the adversary. The first element of that is that China sees critical minerals as both offensive and defensive tools. Beijing's goal is not only to shore up supply, so it's not at risk of supply chain shock. Beijing also uses its leverage over critical mineral supply chains for coercive offensive ends. Over a decade ago, Beijing used its dominance over rare earth supply as leverage in a geopolitical tussle with Japan over the Senkaku Islands. Over the past couple of years, we've seen China again and again implement export controls against the US on critical supplies for which we depend on China. We don't do that in exchange. We're much more focused on shoring up defensive capacity. Second, and maybe most notably, China disproportionately vice its normal approach to R&D innovation and disproportionately vis-a-vis the US invests in early stage innovation at the upstream of critical value chains. Big picture wise, Beijing is much less focused on early stage innovation than is the US, instead focusing on applied and experimental research and development. But that flips when we look at critical minerals. There, Beijing has a host of early stage science and technology projects that are intended to hone the cutting edge of critical mineral value chains in order to lock in China's advantage and enable leapfrog capabilities at the downstream based on upstream strength. And we can speak in more detail to some of those projects in the Q&A if of interest, but at this point, I'll hand it over to the next slide and leave to you.
So given, to jump to the concluding slide of our presentation, given the asymmetric positioning that we've documented and the asymmetric orientations that each side takes, we do see value in the role of the defense acquisition ecosystem. And it starts from the point that the goal of delivering new and emerging capabilities to the battlefield is to deter conflict with our adversaries, like those in China. And the credibility of our deterrent signal, as well as the efficacy of our warfighting capability, depend on material supply. So efforts to compete in the critical mineral battlefield need to be prioritized in that fashion, in understanding that they are core and clearly a piece of the deterrent signal that we can send to China and that the adversary can perceive. As we pursue efforts, as have been activated over the past few years, to develop secure supply, we need to understand where China is positioned, and we need to correspondingly prioritize those resources for defending that we need most urgently and that China has the strongest chokehold over. We also, at the same time, need to be cognizant of the fact that Beijing does have a high degree of pricing power over many of the critical minerals that we're concerned about. So efforts to reshore production need some protection against the market forces that Beijing can manipulate because of their pricing power, which traces back to both their natural resource endowment as well as their outsized role in the downstream and midstream processing, refining of many of the critical materials that we're concerned about. And ultimately, we see value in a strategy moving forward that doubles down on those defensive efforts to develop secure supply, while at the same time activating the defense acquisition ecosystem, the downstream consumers, so those system integrators and platform builders who require these critical mineral inputs in defense acquisition programs to be activated to invest in independent secure supply, which can be done through procurement prohibitions and additional action through FAR, and then also to leverage the innovative resources of the private sector and of the government to invest in the next generation. So invest in the material science and corresponding areas for potential S&T breakthrough that will allow us to leapfrog China's current chokehold. Concluding with another quote here on this slide that comes from the Chinese Ministry of Transport to just underscore that the nature of great power competition with China today is not one restricted just to supply chain interactions or the peacetime salvos that we see in economic warfare, but rather that enterprise competition is entirely against a system. And China's system today is better positioned at the upstream. So thank you all for the time.
Excellent. And just squeaked in the nick of time. Appreciate the staying on the schedule. So again, another critically important topic, and I'll tell you when we get into the Q&A, I'd like to follow up a little bit on that with regards to the impact to programs and how program managers think about that, and as well as our critical infrastructure. A lot of folks probably don't think about the necessity and importance of the critical minerals when they're buying their Tesla or some other system that's part of our general economic engine. So excellent job. Look forward to the Q&A. Our final paper, Audrey Alderset, and her topic is improving arms sales, technology transfer, and defense industrial cooperation with allies and partners. Way to you, Audrey.
Excellent. Thank you, Professor Jones. Pleasure to be here today. My name is Audrey Alderset. I'm a research associate with the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My team, the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group, or DIG, has been working on a project that examines arms sales, technology transfer, and the challenges and enablers to defense industrial cooperation, research led by DIG Director Dr. Cynthia Cook. And in the next slide, we'll jump into the project overview. So CSIS examined the challenges and enablers to defense industrial cooperation between the United States and key allies and partners in the following categories: home country defense industrial priorities, U.S. and home country export control and international acquisition processes, and defense cooperation agreements and programs. So in order to conduct this research, CSIS surveyed the DMAG, the Defense MOU Attaches Group. And this is a group of defense cooperation attaches and defense officials from nations that have reciprocal defense procurement memoranda of understanding, or RDP MOUs. So essentially what RDP MOUs do is they relax provisions from the 1933 Buy American Act that direct the US government to purchase supplies and finished goods domestically. Put simply, RDP MOUs allow foreign vendors to be considered domestic sources. These agreements provide a framework for reciprocal market access to promote standardization, interchangeability, and interoperability. 13 out of 27 DMAG nations responded, including one observer. This was about a 20-question survey, give or take, so the following brief will outline only a sample of the questions that we asked participants. In the next slide, I'll discuss some home country defense industrial priorities. So first, we asked participants to rate 4 goals for defense industrial cooperation as not important, somewhat important, important, very important, and extremely important. The goals include building domestic industry capacity, deterring the threat, ensuring interoperability, and developing regional capabilities. So as you can see on your screen, nations have many reasons for engaging in defense industrial cooperation, with building domestic industry capacity as the most important. It is notable here that no respondent categorized any of these goals as not important or somewhat important. In the next slide, I'll discuss some of the challenges related to U.S. export control processes, a big topic these days. So we asked participants to rate certain U.S. processes as not challenging, somewhat challenging, challenging, very challenging, and extremely challenging. So TISFID, the Technology Security and Foreign Disclosure, was viewed as either very challenging or extremely challenging. So TISFID is one of the key drivers for delays in the defense trade system. Its policies cover sensitive technology areas and aim to balance the risks associated with sharing highly classified U.S. technology and information with the benefits of international cooperation. ITAR, perhaps unsurprisingly, was a close second. It was also viewed as either very challenging or extremely challenging, with the exception of one participant rating it as somewhat challenging. Respondents noted, however, that even though key U.S. export control and technology transfer processes are viewed as at least somewhat challenging, there's an understanding amongst ally and partner nations that these regulations, though complex, exist for a reason, right? And allied nations have their own complex export control regimes that share the same objective as U.S. protection policies, which is to prevent sensitive technology and information from falling into the hands of unfriendly nations. There was no call by survey respondents to eliminate U.S. processes, but rather for a more transparent, streamlined system with predictable lead times that can enhance cooperation and really benefits both nations. The cybersecurity maturity model certification was mostly viewed as very challenging. So CMMC is designed to strengthen defense industrial-based cybersecurity and better safeguard information so that when the DoD shares information with its contractors and subcontractors, they need to have a certain CMMC level in order to win awards. And this can impose inordinate costs, especially on smaller companies. Export administration regulations, direct commercial sales, foreign military sales, and excess defense articles are all viewed as at least somewhat challenging. And again, what's noteworthy here is no respondent rated any of these processes as not challenging. In the next slide, we did a deeper dive on FMS challenges. There's no shortage of those. Lack of clarity and transparency of process was viewed as the most challenging, with the majority of respondents rating it as extremely challenging. Lengthy approval times and the multitude of U.S. stakeholders were pretty split between being viewed as moderately challenging and extremely challenging. At least half of the DMAG survey participants viewed MRO, equipment delays, regulatory compliance, and the costs involved as moderately challenging. So for some FMS programs, congressional review and approval is required, which can significantly delay the FMS process. The threshold values for a sale to require congressional oversight has actually not been adjusted in the last 2 decades, resulting in more cases subject to congressional review now than when the Arms Control Export Act was first implemented in 1976. In the next slide, I'll discuss defense agreements and frameworks that facilitate defense industrial cooperation. So we asked survey participants to rate the following on the basis of how much it benefits their country's ability to do business with the United States. Unsurprisingly, RDP MOUs were the most favored approach to pursuing defense industrial cooperation with the US. This, of course, may be a case of selection bias, given respondents were identified as being part of an organization comprised of RDP MOU holding countries, the DMAG, and therefore, because of that, may be more invested in such agreements. Regardless, this response really reinforces the importance of training DoD program managers on RDP MOUs and additional Buy American exemptions to inform and educate the DoD contracting and acquisition workforce on the proper use of these existing authorities. Respondents favorably viewed defense cooperation aspects of NATO membership, mostly rating it as extremely beneficial. NATO, for instance, has several joint acquisition programs, and in 2021, NATO also established DIANA, the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, to better integrate and deliver new technologies to NATO forces. Additionally, NATO has the defense planning process, which exists to allow allies to harmonize their force and capability planning activities. SOSAs, or Security of Supply Arrangements, allow the United States and participating nations to request priority supply of defense goods and services. This was viewed as both moderately and extremely beneficial. Respondents were pretty split in viewing the Foreign Comparative Test Program as either moderately beneficial or extremely beneficial. The FCT program allows the United States to satisfy its defense needs more quickly and cost efficiently by testing the technologies developed by allies and partners. So it follows a certain try before you buy type logic. And this approach allows roughly a third of foreign vendors to either directly partner with US industry or at the very least establish a US presence. Quality assurance agreements were also roughly split between being viewed as moderately and extremely beneficial. QAs ensure defense products and services meet US military specifications that then reduce the risk of defective parts. They also streamline defense procurement processes, as products certified under nations who have a QA are more readily accepted by the United States and its partners who share interoperability standards. And lastly, defense exportability features, so the practice of encouraging DoD program management, design, and develop exportability features early in a program's lifecycle, was mostly viewed as moderately beneficial. In the next slide, you'll see that we asked respondents to assess the following statement. So, while RDP MOUs waive Buy American provisions, the existence of this exemption is not well recognized in some U.S. program offices. 2 are neutral, 5 agree, and 6 strongly agree that RDP MOU exemptions are not well recognized in some U.S. program offices. There are a variety of potential reasons for this. So first, there may just be misconceptions amongst acquisition contracting officers as to what exactly RDP MOUs are. So survey participants suspected that program offices find it easier to default to purchasing U.S. goods and services because, after all, no one gets fired for buying American. Second, neither the National Defense Industrial Strategy nor the NDIS Implementation Plan mentions RDP MOUs, demonstrating a lack of awareness and understanding of the benefits that RDP MOUs provide to the United States. In the next slide, we asked respondents to assess the following statement. So, influential members of Congress or the executive branch are opposed to the exemptions granted in RDP MOUs, making them less effective than originally perceived. 5 are neutral, 6 agree, and 2 strongly agree that Congress and the executive branch are opposed to RDP MOU exemptions. Congressional debates are frequently centered on protecting American industry, especially today. And without recognizing that these international agreements consider signatory country defense industrial bases as complementary to, rather than in competition with, U.S. defense manufacturing. So this may lead legislators to undermine the cooperative defense industrial relationships that enhance mutual security capabilities. And in the final slide, the team drew some insights and conclusions that I'll share. So first, defense industrial integration with allies and partners presents a compelling business case. So integration extends beyond traditional arms sales and tech transfer. This can include co-production, co-development, etc. And while these collaborative ventures can be complex, expensive, they often require higher upfront investment, they do offer long-term financial benefits by creating economies of scale and ultimately reduce per unit costs. Increased sales aside, closer cooperation ventures also enhance interoperability and can deepen diplomatic relationships. Second, countries within RDP MOU with the United States are hopeful that the agreement will uplift their own industrial bases through consistency in cooperation and sales. So the key word there being consistency. Survey respondents noted that a lack of consistency across administrations can be limiting to defense industrial cooperation. As one survey respondent put it, as the government changes every 4 years, new policies such as the National Defense Industrial Strategy promoted by the Biden administration can lose their momentum. So therefore, defense industry cooperation policy that can be sustainably kept is needed. Third, periodic reviews of export control policy would ensure it appropriately limits technology proliferation without causing undue delays. So ITAR specifically can be viewed as too stringent and out of step with the current era of geopolitical competition. And as I previously mentioned, while DMAG respondents recognize the purpose and importance behind ITAR, they simultaneously critiqued its rigidity and prolonged lead times. Processes like ITAR, TISFIT, and document markings of CUI and no foreign should be carefully managed to ensure that they do not needlessly limit competition and cooperation. Periodic reviews would also help achieve a broader culture change to support systematic alteration to the way that the DoD approaches things like classification markings. Lastly, allies working as a group to procure U.S. systems could be a structural solution to speed the acquisition process. As another survey respondent suggested, the United States should encourage allies to work together when they procure the same systems to more seamlessly increase total allied capability. Ultimately, arms sales and defense industrial cooperation must be reframed not simply as transactional exchanges, but as foundational pillars of collective security strategy. That will require not only regulatory reforms, but a cultural shift within the U.S. government and the defense establishment toward viewing partners as contributors to shared deterrence, not merely customers or risks to be managed. And that will conclude my presentation today. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Audrey. That was a very interesting discussion. I think there's a lot of cross-cutting questions we're going to have here because when you ended there with the culture, I'm going to dig into that in a bit. But before I ask a few of my questions, we have a few questions online, and then I will I'll open up the discussion. So let's start with the audience. And our first question, this is definitely cross-cutting on the across all of the papers. Is from Ariel Dumachevsky. Good evening, Ariel. How are you? He's out of country. So I'll just read his question. You mentioned a recommendation to enhance the MOSA for international partners. That's modular open system architecture for international partners, weapon systems integration. The main challenge there is to make sure that the export policy is aligned with the MOSA initiatives, i.e. access future sovereign upgrade capability and open systems, which can be restricted as part of the TSFD regulations. The question there is, how do you practically suggest to align this in future FMS acquisition policies and programs? So I'll open that up to the whole group. So basically, how do we, allow better integration into the from our restrictions, our most restrictions and TSFD with our sharing within the FMS and the exchange. So anybody, I'll just open it up to the panel. Or I'll pick. So do it again. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, it's
Go ahead.
certainly questions. Oh, is it okay?
Yeah.
It's certainly a question that the survey tried to tackle, and because I think the point that I'll underline that you, Professor Jones, just mentioned was this deeper cultural change that needs to happen, and it needs to be a more kind of broad, collective, interagency effort to create systematic change throughout the system to make FMS, ITAR, TISFID more approachable processes. And something that came up a fair bit in our research was a lack of education as to how the US process works. And while there are phenomenal programs that do offer courses, some are limited, some are being canceled, and a lot of that institutional education and knowledge circulates kind of within home countries themselves. So if there is a lack of knowledge amongst our partner nations, then that's kind of where general information or awareness or understanding as to how our processes work kind of can be very limiting. So that's what I'll say on that one.
No, that's fair. I want to try. I've written down some questions here too. But anybody else want to add to that? So one of the lines of question I had for Nathan, for you, as I was listening to your all's presentation, I just read my notes here. So given the Allies strongly prioritize building their own domestic industrial base, so we're going to obviously enhance their domestic industrial base capacity. How can the U.S., best navigate the inherent tensions between supporting this goal, the goal of our partners and allies? They obviously want to, and we want them to have a stronger industrial base as well, given our relationships. How do we navigate that goal with the goal, our intent of protecting sensitive U.S. technology under ITAR and TSFD? So it could be an inherent conflict, and this also goes a little bit back to the discussion on culture, our presentation from Katy, which I want to get to in a second. But we talk about there's confusion or there's lack of understanding in our processes. We have these regulatory processes. Sounds a lot like our own industrial base, doesn't it? If you were a small business trying to get into the U.S. government, like almost almost feels insurmountable. So there's the same sense there. So how do we, from the U.S. perspective, understanding the need to increase our relationships with our partners, with our need to maintain levels of security? What are your thoughts there? I'll start, Nathan. I'll start with you, and then we'll just open it up.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a fantastic question that clearly draws together the different threads that we've all been hitting at in our presentation. So I'm first of all very excited to hear what Katy and Audrey have to say. And I think generally my sense would be that we need to have both carrots and sticks as we engage, and those themselves may not solve the cultural challenges, but they'll at least make clear the bumps in the road that we may anticipate and how we can resolve them. So and I think that we have a pretty broad-based set of tools to use, both through foreign military sales, FAR, but also through the economic statecraft toolkit that we have. So as we engage with allies and partners to develop new trading relationships and free trade treaties, we can impose through those some degree of rigor and alignment. And I think areas where we're still looking for allies and partners to increase, and that we should be prepared to have sticks at the ready, would be in the way that we review foreign investment, so inbound investment, and also the way that we review access to industrial base to our adversaries. Our allies and partners have differing degrees of exposure to our adversaries, and I think that some of our legacy approaches to engaging with our allies and partners haven't necessarily carried with them the impetus to make sure that our allies and partners are updating those defensive mechanisms. But as allies and partners bring up their systems in terms of security against those potential angles, whether they're research security, investment screening, potential export controls and restrictions, as allies, get over those hurdles, I think we need to be carrying also a heavy bag of carrots to offer rewards. And I think those can be executed through FMS and traditional means. I also think in the current environment, they can be executed through the broader economic statecraft toolkit and through the means that we'll use to renegotiate trading relationships.
Yeah, it sounds like it's not just a defense issue; it's a whole of government. If you look, the instruments of national power, right? Diplomatic, information, military, and economic, where we need perhaps policy, international relations, and those engagements, those continuous engagements. One to have a better understanding of each other, and that allows us to have better communications. Katy, I want to sort of shift it over a little to you. I'm going to we have another question from Peter, and then I'm going to add on to that. And it does, all of these questions are really interrelated. But Peter asks, given the cultural differences you highlighted in sales approaches between Australian and U.S. companies, and again, it's related around to what you were talking about, I think. What specific recommendations would you suggest for Australian companies to better align their pitch strategies with U.S. defense industry expectations? So how do they better compete, I guess, is, how do they communicate and compete in that environment? Do you have any thoughts there, Katy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to just highlight that, this was not necessarily experience shared by all. So, we got some really great anecdotes and different barriers that were highlighted in the research, but just because one company is experiencing doesn't mean it is true across all. But I would say that is something that was really interesting to find out. And I think I think I can't really speak to what the best business pitch is, but I can say that there are resources out there like Austrade that help businesses in Australia looking to sell to the US. And I think that the best advice is to use the resources available, but then also there needs to be more investment on the part of Australia and a part of the US governments in education and in opportunities for learning for companies, for industry. And there really needs to be a connection between the top level messaging of we want this cooperation and then actually providing the resources and the information to really facilitate it. And so through that type of engagement and education and frameworks for cooperation, hopefully different barriers would be able to be addressed, like the ones are, how best to pitch to this country? What are they looking for? What's most likely to be successful? I mean, and that could also be different company to company, and there can be more frameworks in place for the companies that have been successful at it to share that knowledge with the companies trying to pursue the same engagement. So I also wanted to touch back on what we were talking before and what Nathan and Audrey were discussing. In terms of the calculus between being protective of IP and of classified information, but then also promoting cooperation and working with allies and partners, it all really comes down to a risk calculus. And so you really have to decide, is this risk as great as the risks of inaction? And so, yes, there could be slips, cracks where sensitive information gets out, but there's, mostly a system in place to kind of prevent that. And there is a greater risk, one could argue, in being so risk averse and turning down international cooperation options and only going with US vendors, at least for the US case, and only focusing on the buildup of sovereign industry technologies and on not cooperating. The risk you run into is not being able to scale up, not being able to get the capabilities you need, not being able to have defense industrial bases possibly closer to the conflict that you can rely on for both MRO, but then also just for supplies and for having a wider web of production diplomacy. So I think that was really interesting too with what came out about a year ago, the National Defense Industrial Strategy for the US. It was really looking at a kind of risk assessment framework, was what was novel about it, and considering how people can think about promoting, at least for the US, defense cooperation. Ally cooperation was a key tenet of it, and building up the US defense industrial base and accepting certain risks to combat possibly greater risks, like inaction, like building up the capabilities we need for a potential Indo-PACOM fight, having enough capabilities, being able to scale up, all of that. And I think, there's countries like in the terms of AUKUS and with, Australia and US and the UK, they were able to, the UK and Australia are able to amend their regulatory environments to allow this license-free environment. They were able to tackle, the risks of third-party transfer, and, countries, our allies are, has appeared really willing to do the work to kind of decrease those security risks and risks of tech transfer. And I think there really has to be a combined effort on the part of the US to recognize those changes being made and to capitalize on cooperation with these countries, because it's not, I think there's a wrong impression that it's just about competition and that we shouldn't because of having competition with US industry. But a lot of times these countries are providing technologies that we don't already have, and there's other ways that US industry can build up that are not competing and that are compatible and working with and developing with our close allies and partners.
Yeah. So you brought up, I want to sort of pull a thread here for a second. So I really like your term, the DIB closer to the conflict, right? Defense industrial base closer to the conflict, which is near to my heart because as we look across the Indo-PACOM, for example, it's a pretty big theater. We must have these relationships. We must have these defense industrial base aligned to our to the requirements, not just for the U.S. but for our allies and partners, and because we're not going to carry it on our back. We can carry some of it on our back, but we're going to be reliant upon those relationships. That sort of gets at the some of the root of this discussion, right? Some of our policies might be perceived as being impediments to being able to have those kind of relations. This cuts to the thread I want to pull, on the education, on the relationship part, and we'll go back to culture. And so you talked about the learning specific processes as at the Naval Postgraduate School. One of the things we have the luxury of having many international partners here, and so my question is, do you see the ability to perhaps break down some of these barriers by just interacting more, either through educational institutions, overseas exchange tours, getting to know your allies and partners a little bit more than just on the specific project you're working on? When you get to know and understand how different cultures think, how they operate. You brought out some really good examples on the difference of during that briefing, how you present data. So I've been around the world a lot, talking to a lot of different allies, partners, and countries. And what I find is when you get to know folks, you tend to realize that maybe some of these things are impediments more than they are helpful. So what are your thoughts on the real root cause, I should say, real root cause of what's driving some of these conflicts? Or how do you feel about that? And that's open to anybody who wants to comment.
I can tackle it first, and it's so Audrey's actually my coworker and is about 10 feet from me now. But so we've encountered, worked on a lot of stuff together, and we've encountered, our team is focused on a lot of international defense industrial cooperation. It's a lot of the same barriers come up, a lot of the same issues come up, and the education element really has to be part of the puzzle. I don't think there's any one thing that's going to solve it all. It's really going to require a multi-layered approach, but having industries understand what is possible and what other countries are doing is really vital, and seeing those approaches that could then fulfill different MOSA acquisition opportunities in the future, knowing what other countries can put out fast and what specifically with better production techniques, advanced manufacturing techniques, knowing what is there and what is possible is really important, and understanding and I think what that comes down to is then for the US and the US industry and the US government deciding what is worth investing and building up ourselves, or what is with just relying on working with an ally and partner, and where is the trade-off between that based on where we are and where they are, and how we possibly can work together in a way that's not competing against each other, but working towards each of our individual strengths.
So we have one more question online, but I want to just ask you a little bit more specific again for the whole group. And what other metrics could we use? I mean, so we say we want to work together, we have these relationships, but what's our measure other than transactional metrics? Are there any other metrics that you might think of that we can use on how we can assess, how well we're doing in terms of moving towards a better integrated relationship, and reducing the bureaucracy, or is it just the number of programs that we're engaged with, or the number of sales out there on FMS sales or something? Do you see any other potential metric?
I think it could be interesting to see if there's a way of tracking attempts versus successful contracts. So we can see through the contracting data what's being won, but if there's any way to dig deeper into how many how many companies and across different countries are interested and then are taking steps and then are pursuing efforts, and not just those that are getting to those final end stages or winning the contracts. Being able to compare the attempts versus the success rate would be really interesting.
Okay.
Yeah,
Uh,
I can
go
jump
ahead,
in.
Audrey.
Sorry, yeah, if
Go
it's
ahead.
okay, I can jump in too on that. And you can, I think, measure it by macro scale contracts or agreements, like offices. AUKUS is a big one, the National Technology Industrial Base. But you also have things that sometimes fly a little bit more under the radar, like things like RDP MOUs or SOSA, Security of Supply Arrangements, quality assurance agreements that really can facilitate defense industrial cooperation on kind of a more like I want to say almost like daily basis. And things also like being considered a domestic source, perhaps under the US Defense Production Act, or I think another big enabler to these types of processes is maybe like how many things, if feasible, can be moved from like the US munitions list over to the commerce control list, which is just less restricted and easier to navigate.
Great. We have about 4 minutes left. I have one question. I want to get to the question online for the here. So, based from Greg Sanders, one positive example of MOSA cooperation have been open the Future Airborne Capability Environment Consortium and related standards to Five Eyes members. For everybody, have you seen any other positive examples in your studies of successes or at least hopeful moves that should be more widely emulated? And if you can't answer, that's fine. Are there any other examples out there that you might think of that we could sort of learn from, emulate in terms of, in this case, most cooperation?
This won't be MOSA specific, but I think success stories come down to kind of who's going to be at times the first mover. So, we hear a lot of US industry being like, we'd love to partner with foreign industry or foreign governments, but, who's going to front that money? And, if it's industry and there's no multi-year contracts in place, then, they may invest a lot of money into capacity that then isn't utilized and they are no longer the lowest cost bidder. So I think if there is like a framework or agreement in place in terms of like who is going to be basically fronting the cost,
Yeah.
at least initially, that is immensely helpful.
So I think you get to, I can tell you years ago, I'll tell you, international MOSA is important to me because as a former aviator, I've flown in the airfields where the fuel systems weren't compatible and I was sitting for a few days. But one of the other things is the standards. You look at standards, STANAGs, international test procedures. The more of that upfront work perhaps we do together as we're looking at exchanging, the less barriers there are with using each other's equipment. Nathan, do you have any comments? I see you shaking your head there. We have literally 2 minutes left. I'll let you close it out.
Well, I might use that point you just made to circle back to the previous question of things that could be indicators of success. As the US and the larger great power competition with China accelerates, I think that standard question and the degree to which US partners rise to US standards in terms of competing with China is a critical indicator of success and can ease collaboration. So are US partners limiting China's presence in their defense industrial bases? And can we use moves to that end to adjust a risk calculus and say that because those moves have been made on the US partners end, then we can be more open to its presence in our defense industrial base. And I think using basically China exposure as an indicator there is something to monitor and to focus on as we think about international collaboration in the defense industrial base.
Perfect. Great timing. You took us right with about 30 seconds to spare. I want to thank everybody. Fabulous papers, so important. The international relations, international cooperation, and the challenges we have in this area are super. One, they're hard, and two, it's super important. So keep doing that great research. I'm sorry you can't be out here in Monterey with us, but perhaps next year we'll see you here with the follow-on topics. So with that, I want to thank you, and everybody have a great day wherever you are.